Few sights are more majestically serene than the capital of the United States, the great legislative heart of our nation. But the activities of our legislators during the winter of 1849 and 50 were anything but majestic. Certainly they were not serene. True, the United States had just won a war with Mexico. It had gained new lands in the West as big as half of Europe. The territories won included California and New Mexico and Utah, which were later divided to form two more territories, Arizona and Nevada. The congressmen who tromped through Washington's muddy streets and up to this building that winter did not look like contented representatives of a victorious nation. They looked angry, worried, and weary. Tensions were so high, tempers so ragged, that the House of Representatives had to vote 63 times in order to decide on a speaker and get down to the business that so troubled them. The central problem was what to do about slavery in the newly won lands. Should slavery be allowed there? Should it be forbidden? The question gained new intensity when the California Territory applied for statehood. Gold was discovered in California in 1849. People poured into the area from all over the world. Soon 100,000 energetically vocal people lived there. The territory needed the stability of the Union. A free state constitution was written, and an application for statehood sent to Washington, D.C. Now the question had to be faced. Should California be admitted as a free state? There was a balance of 15 free and 15 slave states in the Union. The admission of California would upset the balance. Politicians faced the problem with great reluctance. Slavery was a dangerous subject. It aroused deep economic, political, and religious passions in the American public. In the election of 1848, the major political parties hardly mentioned the subject. But the new Free Soil Party gained 10% of the popular vote with a platform to prohibit slavery in the territories. All of its support was in the North. To any politician, this was an ominous sign. It meant that people were beginning to vote by region rather than by party. The split between North and South was growing. The Union was beginning to creak. Southerners immediately objected to California joining as a free state. Southerners feared that California would set a precedent for the other territories when they organized to become states. With the addition of more free states, the anti-slavery forces would gain strength and become a majority in the Senate, as they already were in the House. That idea made the Southerners shudder. The federal government might then outlaw slavery everywhere. The Southerners had to develop a defense. They argued that the Constitution protected the right of private property. Slaves were property. Therefore, Southerners said, to deny slavery was to deny the Constitution. They felt they had the right to take their slaves wherever they wished in the new lands. For weeks, the members of Congress sought a way out of the dilemma. One suggestion was popular sovereignty. That is, the people of each territory decided if they wanted slavery or not. Another idea was to extend the Missouri Compromise line of 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. This line was established in 1820 to separate slave and non-slave areas in the Louisiana Territory to the Rocky Mountains. Now, some people suggested the line be extended to the Pacific Ocean. But all the proposals raised violent objections from someone. What made these arguments so peculiar was that neither Congress nor the public seemed aware what the new lands were like. After all, the new lands were not a vast Garden of Eden. In fact, it seemed the last place to choose for agriculture of any kind. But that did not moderate popular feelings. Some congressional speeches cranked up indignation to a high pitch. Here are speeches by two congressmen, one from Pennsylvania and one from Georgia. You will not be surprised to learn what the Pennsylvanian had to say.
We are told that California is ours, that New Mexico is ours, won by the valor of our arms. They are free. Shall they remain free? Shall these fair provinces be the inheritance of the white labor of free men or the black labor of slaves? There are those who want slavery to follow in the footsteps of our army.
As a congressman from Georgia, I swear before this country and the living God that if by your legislation you Northerners seek to drive us from the territories purchased by the common blood and treasure of the whole people, and to attempt to fix a national degradation upon half the states of this union, I am for disunion. And if my physical courage be equal to my convictions of right and duty, I will devote all I am and all I have on earth to its consummation.
How is it possible that human beings would wish to extend the barbaric practice of enslaving other human beings in our new and virgin possessions in the West? Will the government lend its power and prestige to establish slavery in these territories?
I am proud of my southern roots. I feel personally insulted every time some Northerner tries to impose his code of conduct on me. Our blacks are treated better by far than those white machine slaves in your cruel northern factories. Our life is based on slavery. How else can we grow cotton? Cotton is needed in the world. We need the western lands for cotton plantations and have the right to move there if we choose.
Shall the South be permitted by aggression, by invasion, by subduing free territory and planting slavery upon it, to wrest these provinces from northern free men and turn them to their own sectional schemes? Men of the North, answer. Shall it be so? Shall we of the North submit to it? If we do, we are cowardly slaves and deserve to have the manacles fastened upon our own limbs.
From 1787 to this hour, the people of the South have asked for nothing but justice. Nothing but the principles and spirit which controlled our fathers in the formation of the Constitution. Unless we are unworthy of our ancestors, we will never accept less as a condition of our union. The territories are the common prosperity of the people of the United States. It is your duty, gentlemen, to remove all impediments to the free enjoyment by all sections and the people of the Union, the slaveholder and the non-slaveholder alike.
Obviously, people had strong convictions about the Western lands, but a rather poor knowledge of the kind of lands they had won in the West. But that didn't seem to make any difference. Southerners claimed that slavery was vital to a cotton economy. They declared that they had the right to establish new cotton plantations and presumably miles of cotton fields in the West. Oddly, the land Southerners coveted appeared ill-suited for their purposes. The weather was too cold, dry, or hot, the land too barren, the transportation too lacking for any cotton plantation, much less flourishing ones. Surely, many Southerners and Northerners were aware of this. The arguments puzzled me, so I paid a visit to Professor Eric Foner of Columbia University. I asked him, why were people so upset over something that was so unlikely to happen?
I think the controversy over the expansion of slavery really arose not simply out of fear about the number of masters and slaves who would actually go out into this Western territory. It arose more from a series of questions of both principle and sectional power. First of all, there was the reality that many people in the North were simply concerned over the expansion of slavery. And this issue had been with the country since the time of the American Revolution. It was debated at the Constitutional Convention. It had arisen in the 1820 at the time of the Missouri controversy. And there were now a larger number of Northerners who simply did not want to see slavery expand in any amount. And then related to that was the question of sectional power. That is to say, the expansion of slavery meant more slave states, and that meant greater power for the South within the councils of the federal government. But even beyond that, I think we have to realize, of course, first of all, that people at the time didn't know how real the threat of slavery expanding. Looking back, we may say it was unlikely that large numbers of slaveholders would go into the Mexican cession, but of course at the time that wasn't perhaps quite so clear. Especially when we consider that this generation of Americans had witnessed in their own lives the very rapid expansion of the institution of slavery. By the middle of the century, there were more slaves in new states than in the old states. In other words, slavery had moved down the center of gravity into the South and West, into states like Mississippi, Alabama, which hadn't even existed at the time of the American Revolution. So that the expansion of slavery was a reality. It was something that people had experienced in their own lives, not simply an abstract question and not simply a fear for the future. And the reality of that slavery had been an expanding institution really raised in a very fundamental way the question of the future of the nation. I mean, really, people, I think, thought they were debating not simply the status of one or two new territories, but really the question of what institutions were going to characterize the West as a whole. And was the West, this vast new region, going to be a slave area or a free area? What kind of labor system was going to exist there? And also, of course, many Northerners who wanted to go out and live in the West themselves also did not want blacks there of any kind, that is, whether free or slave. So in a sense, what's being debated here is really the future of the country, the future course of American development. Is the nation going to be going down a road toward increasing number of slave states and increasing power for Southerners in the nation, or is the West going to be reserved for free labor, free white labor, really, as they called it in the North? So therefore, all these issues really come together in what seems to be a small point of whether slavery is going into the Mexican cession, but really many large questions of both principle, power, and the future development of the country.
These conflicting opinions focused here. This is the old Senate chamber in the Capitol. It looks today exactly as it did over 125 years ago. In this room was played out the great drama that gripped the nation in 1850. A drama played out on several levels. First, the fate of the United States was being decided. Second was a drama between conflicting political and economic ambitions. Third was the main subject of the drama that remained both invisible and mute, the vast black slave population of the United States. The ensuing debates were an exciting spectacle. The leaders of the nation were seen vigorously voicing the desires of the people of their region. Crowds assembled from all over town. When news got out that a famous man would be making a speech on a certain day, people lined up for hours waiting for the doors to this room to open. Then they dashed for seats wherever they could be found. The galleries were jammed. Fashionable ladies sat in chairs in the aisle on the floor. Some days the temperature rose to 100 degrees. Day after day, the chamber and the galleries were packed. The speeches of the legislators were reported down to the last syllable. The words were carried nationwide by the press. The walls of this room resounded with the cries of rage, alarm, applause, cheers, and whistles. 3 powerful old men sat here. They knew now was the time for a major effort at reconciliation, if the Union was to be saved. One was Henry Clay. He sat there. The old compromiser had helped the Union through a similar slave crisis in 1820. In 1850, he was 73, ailing and weary. He had long iron gray hair, sunken cheeks, and wore a black suit. "He looks like a death's head," someone whispered. Another was Daniel Webster. He sat there. He was one of the best orators of his time. His long, sonorous sentences, however, are appreciated less by modern listeners. The other was John C. Calhoun. He usually sat there. But he was very ill. Pale and exhausted, he could not walk to the sessions. He was carried in on a stretcher and placed over there. Calhoun would be dead within the month. Clay and Webster would die within 2 years. All 3 knew this was probably their last great public occasion. Calhoun was so weak, he asked Senator Mason to read his speech for him. Clay spoke first. "Gentlemen," he said,
"The times call for patience, calm, and compromise. You in the northern states can afford to be generous and more understanding about slavery, however repugnant the subject is to you personally. Slavery plays no part in your life. It is not in your economy or your society. But slavery is woven into the very fabric of Southern life. Let me say to the North and to the South what husband and wife say to each other. We have mutual faults. Neither of us is perfect. Let us then be kind to each other. Let us forbear and forgive each other's faults. And I must take occasion here to say that in my opinion, there is no right on the part of any of the states to secede from the Union. There can be a dissolution of the Union only by consent or by war. Consent cannot be expected from the existing state of things. War is the only alternative.
Senator Mason, who speaks for Senator Calhoun of South Carolina.
How can the Union be saved? First, I will tell you how the Union cannot be saved. It cannot be saved by eulogies on the Union. The cry of Union, Union, the glorious Union, can no more prevent disunion than the cry of health, health, glorious health by the doctor can save a patient lying dangerously ill. Besides, this cry of union comes commonly from those whom we cannot believe to be sincere. For if they loved the Union, they would necessarily be devoted to the Constitution. It made the Union, and to destroy the Constitution is to destroy the Union. Give the South equal right in the newly acquired territories. The North should also faithfully fulfill the laws relating to fugitive slaves and desist from agitation concerning the slave question. If you cannot do this, say so. Let the states we both represent agree to separate and part in peace. If you are unwilling we should part in peace, tell us so. We shall know what to do. If you admit California as a free state, you compel us to believe that you intend to exclude us from the whole of the acquired territories.
Senator Webster of Massachusetts. Mr. Speaker, I wish to speak today not as a Massachusetts man, not as a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for the preservation of the Union. Hear me for my cause. There are two dangerous groups in our land today. They are the extremists, the Northern abolitionists and the Southern secessionists. The Northern abolitionists think they can tell right from wrong with the precision of an algebraic equation. It cannot be done. The secessionists delude themselves if they think there could be a peaceable secession. Even if there were a peaceful separation, where is the line to be drawn? What is to remain American? What am I to be? An American no longer? Where is the flag of the Republic to remain? Where is the eagle still to tower? Sir, our ancestors, our fathers, and our grandfathers would rebuke and reproach us. Our children and our grandchildren would cry out, "Shame on us," if we should dishonor those symbols of the power and harmony of the Union. Let us make our generation one of the strongest and brightest links in that golden chain which is destined, I fully believe, to grapple the people of all the states to this Constitution for ages to come.
Webster finished his speech about where I'm standing. He ended by declaring that if the worst did happen, if the Union dissolved, he prayed that he would die before it happened. After days of struggle and debate, Congress got ready to vote on the compromise Clay and Webster had carefully worked out. They tried to balance as much as possible the interests of the North and South. First came the less dangerous points. The land dispute between Texas and New Mexico would go to New Mexico. Texas would be given money to compensate for the loss. The Texas boundary was put about where it is now. Then came the crucial points. California would be admitted as a free state, but slavery would not be restricted in the territories of Utah and New Mexico. When they were ready for statehood, the people in each territory would decide whether it would be free or slave. Slave trading was to be banned in the District of Columbia, but slavery would not be banned there. Further, Congress was to pass a stricter law forcing Northerners to help return fugitive slaves to their lawful owners. Despite all the work, it looked for a while as though the bill was doomed. President Zachary Taylor let it be known he was against some of the provisions of the compromise. In June, Congress voted against the bill. Clay was crushed and retired from public life a deeply disappointed man. But then political fortunes changed. President Taylor died suddenly a few days after a July 4th celebration at the Washington Monument. His successor, Millard Fillmore, put his influence behind compromise. Now, however, Clay was too exhausted to return to the fight. So a young Illinois senator named Stephen A. Douglas took up the job. The Compromise of 1850 was passed due to his vigorous lobbying and persuading. Still, I found something puzzling about it. After all the threats and ultimatums delivered during the long debates, how was compromise possible? I asked Professor Foner, how was it possible for the bills to finally pass?
The Compromise of 1850 it really passed, I guess, as the result of a strategy devised by Stephen A. Douglas, who was then congressman from Illinois. Henry Clay had introduced the compromise, his original proposal in the Senate, as what was called an omnibus bill. That is, all the different aspects were brought together in one measure. The problem with that was that anyone who objected to any one part of the bill tended to vote against the whole thing, and therefore they could not come up with a majority for the whole compromise. Douglas realized that there were a series of majorities that could be put together for the individual parts by getting different groups of congressmen and senators to vote for different parts of the compromise, like the fugitive slave law, etc. So Douglas really shepherded the bills through Congress one by one, rather than as part of a comprehensive single measure. In addition to that, the death of President Zachary Taylor in July of 1850 brought into the White House his vice president, Millard Fillmore, who was much more committed to the compromise than Taylor had been. But I think beyond these questions of individuals and strategy, there is the point that really both political parties at this time contained large constituencies which wanted a compromise. So it's a kind of circular thing. There was a compromise because there was still a large number of people who wanted compromise. The political system had not yet been disrupted by the slavery issue to the point where there did not exist large numbers of people who were willing to subordinate sectional interest, etc., to a compromise which would preserve the Union and preserve the political party system. Both parties knew the slavery issue was very divisive, very dangerous for them, and both of them really marshaled their forces to come up with a compromise to this question. One might really say that this is the end, in a sense, of the old political system, which had been based upon compromising or ignoring, to a large degree, the slavery question. Really, 1850 marks a passage of the political generations. Calhoun dies during the debates. Daniel Webster dies not long afterward. Henry Clay dies in the early 1850s. Really, a new generation of political leaders is rising to the fore, and many of them are not really compromised politicians the way the old generation had been. The rising voice of the North is, for example, William Seward, the senator at this time from New York, who's very much opposed to compromise. Of course, he's defeated here, but who really says, look, the North is more powerful, the North is growing faster than the South. We don't need to compromise. We're going to win anyway, and therefore, why should we compromise? And there are Southerners who, young, fire-eating Southerners, who take a similar position, saying that the South doesn't need to compromise. We can go it alone. So in a sense, the whole debate over the compromise really marks out the political future for the 1850s. On the one hand, you have these new politicians rising who represent sectional interests much more than a national interest. And then on the other hand, you also have the young Douglas, who comes to the fore as the heir to Clay and Webster, as the last of the great Union politicians, the last of the great compromise politicians. And so the debates of the 1850s are really prefigured here. Douglas trying to continue the tradition of political compromise, the political center, but being really torn apart from both the North and the South. And in a sense, Douglas succeeds in 1850, but 10 years later, Douglas will fail.
Regardless of whatever trouble might be over the horizon, Americans now heaved a collective sigh of relief. Of course, some discontent continued on both sides. People praised the compromise more than they liked it. The compromise was now law. The conflict was postponed. The Union was saved by that same spirit of compromise that had created our republic in the first place. In fact, It seems most of our history has been a series of agitations and compromises, agitations and compromises. That's the way a democratic society functions. In 1850, the people spoke through their representatives in this building. They wanted compromise. They longed for a rest from political agitation. Mass meetings were held in the North and South celebrating the passage of the bills. President Fillmore told Congress that he was relieved that a final settlement was made of the dangerous topics. Nearly 50 congressmen from both parties signed a pledge not to support any candidate for public office who threatened to disturb the compromise. Most people probably agreed wholeheartedly with Senator Douglas when he declared he would never again make a speech on slavery. He said, "Everyone should stop agitation, stop debating, and drop the subject." But could they?
The preceding program was funded in part by Frito-Lay.